with our next guest, Carolyn Steel, we are going to zoom out a little bit further to see how the fight against food waste actually connects to food in general and how we use food. Carolyn Steel, she is the author of Hungry City and Sitopia and a food philosopher. She's actually an architect by trade who noticed that how we eat means much more than just whether something tastes nice or whether something looks good or whether it makes us healthy. It also is about how we shape our lives and the lives of other living beings with whom we share the planet. Much of the world around us is actually designed based on the way that we as a society decide to feed ourselves. So in our search for a better future, Carolyn brings forward that we need to reconnect to the true value of our food. So that is what she will bring to us today, a new way, a new perspective on our world through the lens of food. So stay tuned to find out what exactly that means for food waste. And I would like to remind you that if you share a post on social media about the Food Waste Fest with the hashtag Food Waste Fest, or just about your trajectory against food waste in general, it can be anything on your social media, you can win a signed copy of Carolyn Steel's new book. So Carolyn Steel, I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much. And it's been a really inspiring day, so it's wonderful to be part of this conversation. We're just having a little technical hitch with my slides, I believe. Oh, that's looking good. That's the last slide. So we're nearly there. But you know, really just to thank you very much. Perfect, we've got the slides, wonderful. Well, you know, as Tristram so eloquently said in his amazing introduction today, you know, really this all comes down to the fact that we evolved as a species through the sharing of food and through indeed the shared problem of how to eat. So really companionship, I mean, this could easily say companionship at the bottom of this slide, and indeed I often do have the word companionship at the bottom of this slide. So in a sense, I guess what I'm really wanting to talk about today, if we could have the next slide, please, is the fact that food shapes our lives in many ways, you know, many of which we don't realize. It's absolutely the most fundamental thing shaping our lives and world. And if you look, for example, at these images here, you can see that on the top row I've shown, you know, the technologies that we've adopted over time that have helped us to feed ourselves, you know, you could argue better, but you could argue worse as well. But anyway, we've gone from the control of fire to ploughing the land, now to the use of fossil fuels to feed ourselves. And as we've done this, we've evolved from living in a landscape directly that feeds us, I often call it living in the larder, to living in very modified landscapes. And basically in 1800, only 3% of the population lived in cities, so the rest of us were living on farms. And now, of course, we live in cities because we've basically evolved ways of creating food that can allow many of us to be not primary food producers. And interesting, at the same time, what we actually spend our lives doing has changed as well. So again, bottom left, you can see hunter-gatherers. Basically, there's no word for work in the hunter-gatherer societies, because basically sort of just living and breathing and getting food from the environment is pretty much what people spend their time doing. So it's not a sort of separate activity. So we've gone from that to a sort of very crafts-based world where we're working with very specific food production. And of course, now again, we've moved so that most of us have nothing to do with producing our own food. We've gone from being feeders to being fed. And of course, you know, we often think of this transition as progress. If I could have the next slide, please. You know, we think of this transition as progress, but actually there's huge question marks, again, as Tristram said in his introduction, about where this is leading us. So again, on the top, where do we go from here? You know, do we start eating weird sort of substitutes like Soylent, which are kind of non-food, or do we start making protein from air, as this company on the right is doing? Do we, you know, what do the cities of the future look like? Are we going to start growing food in cities again, or are we going to, you know, create kind of weird sort of techno farms? And what are we going to ourselves do? Are we going to, you know, is this really a good life? I mean, robots are taking over our world. and we ourselves are getting, really fat and kind of basically sort of losing a meaning in life. So it's a very difficult trajectory and future that this idea of a good life that we're pursuing is leading us in. Next slide, please. As I say, we've gone from living in the larder, and of course, there's a reason why this kind of life has been described, by almost every culture in the world as a kind of paradise, because basically living in an environment that just supplies you with food, and where, of course, it's sort of, there's the sense of being absolutely at one with nature is very, very profound, is something that, if I have the next slide, please. I am going to try and type in the messages from now on. We went from this kind of environment to one where there's a division between the business of producing food and living in the world, and the city where, as I say, most people were not actively involved in food production, but were just receiving food and distributing it. So with the co-evolution of agriculture and cities, we get this kind of split, and with it a kind of the beginning of the loss of understanding about what food really is, and indeed, the fact that it is the most profound thing that connects us to one another, and also to the natural world. Thank you. So there have been moments in urban history, which, by the way, has been going on for about 5,500 years, when we have achieved a kind of balance. And my favorite image to describe this is this wonderful fresco of Ambrogio Lorenzetti's, which sits on one wall of the town hall in Siena. And it's non-accidental, indeed, that it's called the Allegory, the Effects of Good Government, because this is actually what the 14th century Sienese understood to be the result of good government, is that you would achieve a perfect balance between the city on the one hand and the landscape that fed it on the other. So city and country, which is really the sort of the partnership that lies at the heart of urban civilization, but which we often forget. And part of the reason we forget it is that, of course, today we don't necessarily see this relationship. Often the landscapes that feed us are thousands of miles away. They're not necessarily the kinds of landscapes you choose to paint and stick on the wall of your town hall. So we're mentally and physically distanced from the landscapes that feed us. Thank you. Next slide. And what's interesting as well is, with this progression from living in the larder to farming, this is often portrayed as a punishment, because actually farming was a much harder way of life than hunting and gathering had been. And indeed, its main advantage was that it could produce a lot of a grain surplus that was able to feed large non-food producing populations. But as I say, it's always been treated with this kind of this sense that we've somehow fallen from an ideal relationship with the landscape that feeds us before. Next slide, please. And out of this comes a sort of a dream. I mean, this very sort of well-known wonderful image of Bruegel's, of the land of cocaine, which was this dream of the medieval peasants, that basically they wouldn't have to work to feed themselves anymore, because the world itself would be made of food, and the gingerbread would kind of be, roofs would be made of gingerbread, rivers would flow with wine, pigs would run around with knives in their back, and everyone would just be able to eat all day and then snooze kind of in the sun. Thanks. Next slide. And of course, with industrialization, which really is the beginning of the sort of the ravaging of the natural world that Tristram spoke about in his introduction. I mean, you can just see one example here, going from a grassland grazed by bison and inhabited by Native Americans, by the way, through to a mass extermination, and then the creation of these enormous chemically fed monocultures, which then in turn created the illusion of cheap food. There is no such thing as cheap food. It's just created by mass externalization of all its costs. And down bottom right, we see the invention really of cheap meat, which has been described variously as the greatest ecological catastrophe in human history, because it's just wrong on so many levels, not least the fact that cattle evolved to eat grass, which is why we co-evolved to live with them. But that's a very long story I don't have time for now. But anyway, it's why we're pumping the cattle full of antibiotics and they're getting ill. And of course, the grain could feed 10 times as many of us if we just ate it directly. Next slide, please. So, as I say, and again, Tristram talked about this a lot in his talk, you know, we've reached this point where we've created the world that appears to be the land of cocaine. It appears to have solved the problem of how to eat. But of course, it's the opposite of solving the problem. We can't cope, our brains can't cope with this kind of food because we're still hunter-gatherers inside, as it were, and we can't really switch off the urge to eat salt, sugar, and fat if they're presented to us, particularly if they occur together, which they don't do in nature. And also, of course, it's making us very, very ill, as well as destroying the planet. So it's lose-lose on every possible level. Next slide, please. And this just graphically shows you what's been happening to the price of food. As I say, that the actual production of food, the fact that food consists of living things that we nurture and kill so we can live, should tell you that there's no such thing as cheap food, because basically food is life. And yet this is what has happened in the leading industrial nation on earth to the cost of food over the last 80 years. Next slide, please. But as I say, this has been at terrible, terrible cost. Again, Tristram mentioned some of these in his introduction, but you know, the loss of global soils due to this monocultural farming, climate change, about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with food and farming, the loss of fresh water, the fact that we're both undernourished and fat, which is a historical first. I should have a picture of COVID here, actually, because, of course, COVID itself is an outcome of the fact that we have lost our biodiversity and we're encroaching on areas of wilderness where we shouldn't be. Feeding grain to animals. This image actually is from Tristram, the one about the food waste. That's from a supermarket dumpster. The fact that we don't value food, so we waste it. We're spending 10 calories of energy on every calorie of food we consume. And of course, we're entering a sixth mass extinction, again, largely to do with climate change and the use of chemicals in farming. Next slide, please. So we're heading towards catastrophe. This is the kind of the food culture that's going global. It's a disaster on every possible level. Next slide, please. It's time for a rethink. And I love this quote of the British architect Cedric Price. He says, technology is the answer, but what was the question? Next slide, please. And I think it's very interesting that we often forget to remind ourselves of the big questions. And I think one of the things that I find really powerful about thinking through the lens of food is that it does force us to ask that question. And the questions are simple. They are, what is a good life? What is a good society? And how can we balance our needs with those of our fellow humans and our fellow non-humans, i.e. the planet, the living planet? And it's very interesting to me that this question is really central to much utopian thinking. So if you look at these three slides, for example, rather these three images, Plato, Thomas More, Ebenezer Howard, they're all talking about how you balance that relationship between the city and the countryside that I began with. And the answer that, was it's absolutely essential that there is a balance between those two things. Next slide, please. And it's to do with, the Greeks had a word for this, they called it Oikonomia. And very briefly, that means household management, from oikos for house and nomos management. And basically, if the idea was, and this is Aristotle you're looking at here, if every citizen has a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm feeds the house, then you have oikonomia, which is you have good household management. And if everyone has that, then the city is self-sufficient. So it's a kind of vision really for bringing society and nature together. And I think this is something that's very beautifully summed up in Aristotle's term political animals, which is, he called us famously, because it talks about this duality that we're always trying to overcome as humans, that we need to be with each other, but we also need nature. Next slide, please. And this indeed is why I invented the word Sitopia. It means food place, and it's really a kind of food-based alternative to utopia, which by means of being ideal actually can't exist. So my argument really is that food shapes our lives in many ways, some of which we're aware of, you know, when we can't do up our trousers after Christmas, but many of which we're not aware of. So food shapes our bodies, our minds, our cities, our landscapes, our economics, and our politics. But we don't value food because we've built society on this idea of cheap food, which, as I've explained, doesn't exist. So the shorthand to building a better world, indeed a better Sitopia, is to revalue food. Next slide, please. There's many, I mean, again, you know, just to understand the way food shapes our world, you can sort of see it as a flow going through our lives from the landscape where it's produced to the city where it's exchanged into us and into our bodies. And the bottom pictures show sort of alternatives to the eating experience, one of which promotes companionship and one of which very clearly doesn't. At the top, you can see the contrast between cows eating grass, which they evolved to do, which is a beautiful synergy, or cows in a concentrated animal feeding operation. And in the middle, again, as Tristram pointed out, you know, to go to the middle of the city and meet people, which is how cities indeed evolved, or whether you go, you know, leave the city in the name of efficiency, or indeed just dial food up on your phone and expect some peppermint-clad slave to deliver it. So the question really is, which of these solutions to feeding ourselves actually feeds into a good life? Next slide, please. It's very ironic to me that it's usually at times of crisis that we understand the true value of food, because there isn't enough. So, for example, you can see here 3 crises. You can see London in the Second World War. You can see Havana after the fall of the Soviet Union. You can see Detroit after all the cars left. And guess what? Everybody goes immediately back to growing food. And not only that, but actually to sharing food and creating new networks around food. Next slide, please. Now, COVID has demonstrated many, many aspects of the way our food system and indeed our way of life is fragile. You know, mass migration in India, social inequality, the fact we don't pull our food out of the ground ourselves, and of course, loss of biodiversity and encroachment on wilderness. Next slide, please. But again, as Tristram mentioned, it's also been, the response to it has also shown potential for amazing resilience. The fact that people have discovered the joy of living in time again. They've been neighbourly, they've cooked with their kids, they've valued food more, they've created greater food networks, local food networks, and they've got much more interested in growing their own. And indeed, again, as Tristram said, much more interested in nature, the nature around them. These are all things that I've been arguing for in my book, Sitopia, and I've run out of time, but I've only got about 3 more slides, so I'll just carry on to the end. You know, basically, if we're going to build a good zero carbon life, it has to be built around valuing the stuff in life that really is valuable, and there is nothing more valuable in life than food. Next slide, please. We can become co-producers. I think this, again, feeds into what Tristram's talking about with companionship. You know, we can pay farmers to grow our food directly with us, and we can work with them. We can join food co-ops. We can grow food in the city. We can support organic local farmers. This is all about valuing food. Next slide, please. We can embed food in our thinking and reincorporate it into the spaces we live in. So growing food on roofs, making space for farmers markets, embedding it in a social policy, creating wonderful spaces like the bottom middle is a Pact in Antwerp, an absolutely wonderful space that, of course, our host will know extremely well, I'm sure, that combines food growing with a sort of sociability and, you know, really putting food at the heart of society again. Next slide, please. And again, as I said, it's about ways that we can bring the city and the country closer together again. And there are many examples of this historically. It's at the heart of utopia, but it's also something that modern architects are struggling with. For example, MVRDV, bottom right, building a new extension to the city of Elmira, which incorporates food, or Burnham-Viljean re-inhabiting the city with food. Next slide, please. It goes without saying we have to farm with nature and not against it. And I normally have much more slides about regenerative farming. I just took them out due to time, but I really reinforced that point that Tristram made again. For me, it's about seeing through food and understanding that the world we live in is shaped by food. We live in a Sitopia, just a bad one because we don't value food. Next slide, please. But it does come back to companionship. And again, I often have the word companionship at the bottom of this slide. For me, a good society is one in which everybody eats well. And if we eat well, and of course this is a revolutionary idea because it means we can't have people who can't afford good food, then that is the key to not wasting. Next slide, please. I'm going to finish with this wonderful quote by Victor Hugo. He says, the sewer is a cynic. And he's basically talking about the fact that you can judge a society by what it throws away. And I think if we learn to value food and again, sort of go to the pleasure principle and the fact that food, the sharing of food is how we evolved as a species, that is the most direct way we have not only of stopping food waste, but of building a better world. And if I could have the final slide, please. That's why I've gone as far as to call this book Sitopia, How Food Can Save the World, because I genuinely think by revaluing food, we can build that better world that we're all really desperately hoping for post-COVID. Thank you very much indeed. Sorry, that was such a rush.
No worries. Thank you very much, Caroline. I have a couple of last questions for you. We're always talking about how COVID is now bringing this momentum and an opportunity for maybe revaluing our food. That is something that we could do once this is over, or this could be the start of this. Well, we've seen that in this pandemic, there was a shift to reliance on local food systems. How do you think that this, maybe not whether you think there is a momentum, but how we can grab this as a momentum and really take this as an opportunity also to fight food waste? How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, again, I don't think I've ever echoed a speaker more than I have Tristram in my sort of in my keynote. But I mean, again, to echo what he said, I think there's probably the best opportunity we're ever going to have now of not just changing the way we value food, but actually through that, rethinking the way we live. And it's already happening because, as I said, people are understanding that to be located in a place, there's so many people in the UK were kind of saying, I've never noticed spring happening before, because I'm always too busy rushing to work to actually go into my local park and see a tree unfolding through the course of the spring. People really understanding the value of, many of my friends, but also many people, who've never bought food directly from a producer before, have been doing that, and it's been revelatory to them, and I think we really did forget about what food can be, not just as a sort of sustenance, but as really the core of a good life, particularly in nations like the UK, and I dare say in Belgium as well, where we're sort of, the good life that we're pursuing is one about getting rich. It's all about money. And of course, money has nothing to do with real value. It's just it's just an abstraction, really. And many of the things that make us happy have nothing to do with it at all. So having time, for example, to undo that evil coupling that Benjamin Franklin came up with when he said time is money. Time is not money. Time is time, and time is just having the space to breathe and enjoy being with people you love, companionship, nature, and actually paying attention to the things in life that really make us happy. And I think this is a great insight of Epicurus's, who I didn't have time to talk about today, but Epicurus said that, the way to be happy is to get pleasure out of the necessary. And there's nothing more necessary or pleasant than eating. So I think, not wasting food is all about valuing food. And again, to endorse what Tristram said, we have to get out of this idea that food is cheap, and can be cheap. It just is not. It's a fake construct. And I think by connecting people with growing food and cooking food and so on, that is the way to get them to go, well, I don't want this super processed weird cereal with 8 tons of sugar in it. I actually just want fresh vegetables I've cooked myself, and I want to cook with my kids. But to create that is revolutionary, because you have to give people the space and the time and if you like, the money, enough money to not be rushing around like an idiot trying to just keep their lives going. So I think there's an alternative window, like a Philip Pullman little window into another world that we're glimpsing here. And I think, there will never be a better time to build on it. So I really, really hope we can do that.
All right, thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I don't mean money, really time. But if I'm sure that everybody is very curious now to read the rest of your book. I'm halfway through it, and I can highly recommend it. So you have a chance at winning this. You notice if you tag along in the social media craze, or you can just read it yourself, however you like. Thank you very much, Carolyn Steel, for being present with us today.